30 years. That is how long Russia kept a loaded gun pressed against Moldova's head. Not a metaphor, an actual military garrison. 1,500 soldiers, stationed inside a strip of land that Moldova legally owns but cannot touch. A frozen conflict deliberately kept frozen because a thawing Transnistria meant a free Moldova, and a free Moldova meant one less piece of leverage in Putin's hand. Moscow called it peacekeeping. The facts are undeniable. It was a hostage situation dressed in uniform. And here's the part that should make every defense analyst stop and read twice. Russia did not lose Transnistria in a battle. Russia did not lose it to a superior army, a NATO airstrike, or a Ukrainian armored column. Russia is losing it to a border checkpoint, a legal document, a calendar date. As of January 1st, 2026, those 1,500 soldiers have no fuel resupply, no ammunition delivery, no safe air corridor, no overland route home. They are sitting on top of 44 million pounds of expired Soviet ammunition, the largest illegal weapons stockpile in Eastern Europe, and Moscow cannot reach them. One of the world's largest armies, trapped by paperwork. Putin built Transnistria as a knife against Moldova. Moldova just turned the handle around and Putin never saw it coming. Transnistria is not a random piece of land. It is a thin strip of territory running between the Dnistru River and the Ukrainian border, barely 25 miles wide at its broadest point. No coastline, no direct road to Russia, no independent air corridor. On a standard map, it barely registers as a geographic feature worth noting. But Moscow did not value Transnistria for its size. Moscow valued it for its position. Since 1992, Russia has maintained a military garrison inside this strip. Not because the region could project overwhelming force, but because it sat in exactly the right place to do three things simultaneously: press a knife against Moldova's side force Ukraine to keep watching its southwestern flank even while its eastern front burned, and remind every government between Warsaw and Bucharest that the Soviet map had not fully dissolved. That is what made Transnistria dangerous, not firepower, geography. Every forward operating base in military history runs on the same iron rule. It is only as powerful as its supply line. Cut the supply line and the most strategically placed garrison in the world becomes a liability. Cut it long enough and that liability becomes a trap. The base does not disappear. The soldiers do not vanish, but their ability to act, to threaten to project power that evaporates. Moldova and Ukraine understood this rule better than Moscow anticipated. Starting January 1st, 2026, Ukraine tightened control along every mile of its border with Transnistria. Every crossing point, every informal track, every gray zone channel that had quietly moved people, goods, and political influence for years. Moldova simultaneously expanded its checkpoint network and deployed mobile patrol units to cover the western and northern edges of the region. The operation did not require a single artillery round. It required coordination, patience, and the political will to act. Here is what that looked like in practical terms. Routes that once operated in shadow now had cameras. Crossings that once functioned on informal arrangements now required documentation. A gray zone that had survived for 3 decades on deliberate ambiguity was suddenly forced back inside the boundaries of actual law. Every informal logistics channel that had kept the Russian contingent quietly supplied was identified, monitored, and shut down. One by one, methodically, without announcement. Transnistria has no seaport. The airspace over Moldova falls under Chisinau's authority. No aircraft lands without explicit approval. Every overland route runs through either Ukrainian or Moldovan-controlled territory. There is no corridor left that Moscow controls. The geography that once made Transnistria a perfect pressure point now made it a perfect cage. Now consider what 1,500 soldiers without a functional supply line actually means on the ground. No fuel resupply means vehicles stop moving. Generators stop running. Heating systems in those Soviet-era storage facilities stop functioning. No ammunition resupply means the garrison's ability to sustain any kind of military posture degrades with every passing week. No personnel rotation means the same exhausted, increasingly isolated men remain in place with no relief in sight. A base without supply is not a threat. It is a hostage with a flag. And here's the detail Moscow does not want discussed openly. The facts are undeniable. A significant portion of those 1,500 soldiers are not hardened troops rotated in from Russian bases. Many are local men who are handed Russian passports, people who have never set foot on Russian soil. Moscow calls them Russian citizens requiring protection. The reality is, Moscow has no clean logistical path to protect them, supply them, or extract them. Russia built a pressure point in Eastern Europe. Moldova and Ukraine simply enforced the map that already existed. They did not invade, they did not escalate. They applied border controls that any sovereign nation has the legal right to apply. And in doing so, they turned Russia's greatest regional asset into its most embarrassing liability. The geography did not change, what changed was who controlled it. A base without supply is not a threat, it is a hostage with a flag. And that flag is becoming harder for Moscow to explain every single day. But geography was only the first lock on the cage. The second lock was colder, sharper, and aimed directly at the Russian chain of command. Moldova did not shoot at Russian officers. It did something far more calculated. It made their presence on Moldovan soil legally poisonous. An army does not only survive on weapons, it survives on orders, it survives on paperwork, it survives on freedom of movement. It survives on the ability to rotate personnel, meet with commanders, leave the area, return to the area, and maintain the political narrative that it has the legal right to be there at all. Remove those things, and the guns become irrelevant. Moldova understood that. So Chisinau did not need to launch a military operation against Transnistria. Moldova chose a colder path, a sharper one. It declared several Russian officers stationed in Transnistria persona non grata on Moldovan territory. To a casual observer, that phrase sounds like dry diplomatic language, but to an isolated garrison with no supply line and no exit route, it is the sound of a steel door closing. Persona non grata means unwelcome, but in the context of Transnistria in 2026, it means something far more precise than that. The Russian officers placed on that list now face a calculated trap. If they want to legalize their status under Moldovan law, they must physically enter Moldovan-controlled territory. But the moment they step across, they risk detention, deportation, or being held at a checkpoint with no clear path back. Moldova has made the act of movement itself into a legal risk. A commander who cannot move freely is a commander whose authority has been surgically reduced. A command structure that cannot communicate normally with the outside world is a command structure being slowly suffocated. This is not a battlefield ambush. This is a legal ambush. And for an isolated army, law can cut deeper than artillery. The names on that persona non grata list are specific. Commander Dmitry Zelenkov, Deputy Commanders Dmitry Opalev, Sergei Mashenko and Sergei Shirshov, Chief of Staff Marat Yarulin, and Alex Bogomolov. These are not low-level functionaries. These are the men who execute Moscow's orders on the ground in Transnistria. By placing them on that list, Moldova did not just inconvenience a few officers. Moldova severed the operational nerve connecting the Kremlin's intentions to the boots on the ground inside that narrow strip of land. Think about what that means in practice. A general in Moscow can issue an order. But if the officers who are supposed to execute that order cannot move freely, cannot coordinate openly, and cannot operate without risking immediate legal consequences, the moment they step outside the garrison perimeter, that order loses its weight before it reaches anyone. For years, Moscow dressed its presence in Transnistria with acceptable language: peacekeeping, stability, operations, protecting the local population, guarding the ammunition depot. Each label gave Russia a layer of political cover. Each label gave Western governments just enough diplomatic ambiguity to avoid forcing a direct confrontation. Each label kept the fiction alive that Russia's soldiers in Transnistria were something other than an illegal occupying force inside a sovereign European nation. Moldova is now stripping every one of those labels away, one legal decision at a time, one persona non grata notice at a time, one checkpoint, one documented crossing, one filed legal record at a time. This matters far beyond Transnistria itself. Every legal action Moldova takes builds a case file. a documented, internationally legible record showing that Russia's military presence in this region has no valid legal foundation, no recognized peacekeeping mandate, and no status under any framework that the international community accepts. That case file is not aimed at the Russian officers in Transnistria, it is aimed at Brussels, at Washington, at every institution that has watched this frozen conflict and chosen to look the other way. Moldova is not asking the world to act. Moldova is making it impossible for the world to pretend it does not see. The facts are undeniable. Russia is not a peacekeeper in Transnistria. Russia is a trespasser whose paperwork expired 30 years ago, and Moldova is now enforcing the eviction notice. This is the kind of battlefield Russia genuinely cannot navigate. If Moldova used artillery, Russia could frame it as aggression. If Moldova sent tanks, Russia could build a propaganda campaign around invasion. But Moldova used law. Moldova used the recognized borders of a sovereign state. Moldova used the same legal instruments that every legitimate government on Earth has the right to use. And on that battlefield, Russian tanks solve nothing. Russian missiles open no corridors, and Russian state television cannot turn an officer blocked at a checkpoint into a symbol of victory. This is not a battlefield ambush. This is a legal ambush. And for an isolated army, law can cut deeper than artillery. But even this legal trap is not the most dangerous part of this story. Because under Transnistria sits Cabana's 44 million pounds of Soviet ammunition that has quietly transformed from Russia's best excuse to stay into Russia's most unmanageable liability. Cabanas, that name does not appear on the evening news in America. It does not trend on any platform. It does not get discussed in prime time. Most people who follow European geopolitics closely have never heard it spoken out loud in a serious policy conversation. But inside certain closed-door briefings in Brussels, in specific corners of the Pentagon, and in the working groups of NATO's Southeastern Command, Cabanas is the word that stops conversations cold. It is an ammunition depot in northern Transnistria. Built to serve the Soviet Union's 14th Army, the massive military formation that occupied East Germany and Czechoslovakia during the Cold War. When that empire collapsed and that army withdrew, it left behind everything it could not carry. The current inventory is documented at approximately 20,000 metric tons of heavy ordnance. That converts to roughly 44 million pounds. Artillery shells, tank rounds, small arms cartridges, metal built for a war that never came. Now here is the number that should make you stop completely. 57% of those munitions have passed their expiration date. That is not a minor maintenance footnote. Expired military ammunition does not simply become inert. The chemical propellants degrade and grow unstable. The casings corrode from the inside. The explosive compounds shift in ways that make detonation unpredictable, not impossible. Less controlled, more dangerous with every passing season. You have 44 million pounds of aging, chemically unstable ordnance packed into Soviet-era warehouses in a region with no functioning central government, guarded by soldiers who are running low on fuel to heat those same facilities through the winter. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, has attempted multiple inspection visits to Cabanas over the years. Every single attempt was blocked at the gate. Armed. No independent verification has ever been completed. The stated inventory comes entirely from Russian self-reporting from a government with every incentive to understate what is actually stored there. If Cabanas detonate, the blast radius covers dozens of miles. Chisinau sits less than 50 miles away. Romania's border NATO territory sits less than 60 miles away. The environmental contamination from an event of that scale would persist for decades. This is not a regional risk. This is a continental one. But here is the strategic dimension that most analysis consistently misses. Moldova understands every word of that risk calculation, and Moldova is using it. For years, Russia cited Cabanas as its primary justification for maintaining troops in Transnistria. We are here to guard the depot. We are here to prevent an accident. We are the responsible party, ensuring regional stability. That argument gave Moscow a veneer of legitimacy that was difficult to attack directly without appearing reckless. But when Moldova withdrew from the CIS on April 8, 2026, that justification collapsed legally. Russia no longer has recognized status on Moldovan soil. The soldiers guarding cabanas are now, by the standards of international law, an illegal occupying force. And the depot they claim to be protecting has become an unowned, unmonitored, internationally unacceptable liability sitting in the middle of Europe. That transforms cabanas from Russia's excuse into Moldova's leverage. The Kremlin wanted a frozen conflict. It may end up with a frozen garrison. Every Western government now has a direct security interest in resolving the cabana situation. Every EU institution, every NATO member state is within range of the potential blast radius. Moldova holds the diplomatic key to any internationally supervised resolution, and Moldova is under no obligation to hand that key to Moscow. This is not a vulnerability. This is leverage of the highest strategic order. Meanwhile, the broader picture is shifting in ways that go far beyond one ammunition depot. Moldova is advancing toward EU membership at a pace that analysts in Brussels describe as the fastest and most credible accession process currently active. Energy infrastructure connecting Moldova to European grids has already been built. Road and bridge connections across the Prut River linking Moldova to Romania are expanding. Military cooperation frameworks are deepening with every passing month. Romania is a full NATO member. Every infrastructure link, every energy connection, every defense cooperation agreement pulls Moldova closer into a strategic space that is fundamentally incompatible with continued Russian military presence on its soil. The Kremlin wanted a pressure point in Eastern Europe. Moldova is turning that pressure point into the most documented, most internationally visible, most legally exposed military overstay in modern European history. Russia spent 30 years building this position. Moldova is dismantling it legally, methodically, and without firing a single round. But the final question is the one nobody in Washington is asking out loud yet. What happens when Moldova stops being a neighbor of NATO and becomes NATO itself? 30 years ago, Moscow planted a garrison in a strip of land most Americans cannot find on a map. It was not an accident, it was architecture. Designed to keep one small country permanently off balance, permanently looking over its shoulder, permanently unable to choose its own direction without calculating the cost of Russian disapproval. That architecture held for 3 decades. It is not holding anymore. Not because a superior army dismantled it, not because NATO intervened, not because Washington wrote a check large enough to change the math. It is collapsing because 2 countries, one of them fighting for survival on its eastern front, the other barely larger than the state of Maryland, decided to enforce the map that already existed and dared Moscow to respond. Moscow is responding with statements. Statements do not resupply a garrison. Statements do not reopen a border. Statements do not transform a legally expired military presence into something the international community is obligated to respect. Here is what the facts show. 1,500 soldiers trapped, sitting on 44 million pounds of ammunition that no one is allowed to inspect in a region that no longer has any legal framework protecting their presence. A command structure that cannot move freely, supply lines that no longer exist. Legal cover that has been systematically stripped away, one signed document at a time. Russia built a knife, Moldova picked it up. That is not a small story. That is the template for every frozen conflict, every gray zone, every piece of post-Soviet leverage that Moscow still holds across Eastern Europe. And if that template holds here, other capitals are watching and taking notes right now. The question is not whether Russia loses Transnistria. The question is what falls next and whether the West is paying close enough attention to see it coming before it does. If you want to know which flashpoint is moving next, stay close. That is exactly where this channel is going.